Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you.
Thank you, Boris. I believe him too. I think he's living in the light. Thank you, Boris. Beautiful work. Thank you. How many of you remember John Hardesty, who wrote that? Yeah. I could hear John singing behind you, Boris. I could kind of, hear him. So really glad that you guys are all here today. We are still in our Back to the Beginning series, which is really going back to the beginning of the Bible and looking at some of the earliest stories. And we've been looking at really what's considered to be the allegories. They're the stories that are not meant to be taken as historically true or factual. Not everybody appears to know that, but that is the case. And so what makes them really powerful teaching tools is when you look at things as allegory or as examples, a metaphor for our lives. I mean, I think even Jesus told the gospel is full of stories that Jesus told. They were considered to be parables, so that was kind of easier. It didn't sound like he was actually talking about a life experience of his, but rather a way in which we could insert ourselves into that story and find a dynamic in that story that teaches us or that changes us or that gives us a new awareness or a new worldview, breaks open our hearts. Stories have a tendency to break open our hearts because they connect with us. We are story makers, in our lives. We're the species that tell stories, and we live a lot of times too much in our heads. And so stories are sometimes the way to draw our hearts into that experience, and it is there that the rubber meets the road. Is when our hearts change, when our hearts open, when we become fed at a heart level, that we make new decisions. We are very much led by our hearts and by our emotions, by our feelings, and we make decisions that way. We make a decision, and then we have 5 reasons why we did it. You know that? Well, I did that because blah, blah, blah. Well, blah, 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 blah. Makes it sound like you sat there with a pencil and paper and really thought it out before you slammed on the brakes and called somebody a terrible person, But you had 5 reasons afterwards that came to mind when you were defending yourself. So we're really good at that. But the point is that we are really making decisions based on how open our hearts are at any given time. And so tonight, I'm going to be talking about a story that is not very heart-opening. You're probably familiar with. We're going to be talking about Cain and Abel. And the origins of this particular story is thought to be at least a reference to a Babylonian myth of where God was more pleased with one brother than he was with another brother. Their offering wasn't acceptable, or liked one guy better than another. Mom always liked you best. That kind of drama and conflict, right? Well, when it's God, the stakes go way up. When God's involved. So in this case, Babylonian myth is a possible reference, and the Hebrews were in exile in Babylon for about 400 years. So they really got acclimated into the culture that they were oppressed in, or that they were sort of exiled in, until the time that they returned home. So a lot of their stories, if they had them before, got torqued with some of that influence as well. The Hebrew origin story, Cain and Abel, is actually a fratricide, the killing of a brother and conflict. I don't think I'm giving anything away. I know some of you might be sitting on the edge of your seat wondering what happens, but one of the brothers kills the other, but I'll let you decide which one it is. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, though, you find the brothers, there are brother conflict stories. One's more favored. One's the one that's supposed to get the title, but the other one, the younger one, gets it. The youngest brother of the smallest tribe turns out to be the greatest warrior and becomes king. There's all kinds of really cool turning around stories in the Hebrew Bible, but there is also a lot of conflict and a lot of brotherly conflicts. But it leads to a lot of beautiful stories that unfold because we're storytellers, and some of our greatest secrets and also some of our greatest triumphs come after those conflicts find an unexpected turn and revelation and a more beautiful resolution than the expected route would have delivered. If everything happened the way we thought, we wouldn't have to live it. That's my theory. I think everything changes. If I could imagine how this whole story was going to turn out, I might as well stay in bed. There's no reason to get up and go do anything because you already know how it's supposed to go. Game of Thrones. I'm just saying, just saying. If you know how it's supposed to go, then why did you watch it? So that's obviously another talk for another time, but the Cain and Abel story is also origin of murder and its consequences. So if you didn't need some more reasons not to murder, we will talk about some of those tonight as well. So, but looking more closely, let's just tell the story already, Karen. So let's actually hear this story. It's in Genesis chapter 4. And it's almost the whole chapter, so here we go. Now the man knew his wife Eve. We're talking about Adam. We're going all the way back to the beginning. So Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of the flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Basically, it says that he refused Cain's offering, we don't know what exactly that means, like technically what happened there. How did one get the favor of God, and how was that known, and how was that obvious to anybody? But here's what the story goes. And so it is understood that everybody must have known this, and everybody experienced it, and Cain was shamed by it. Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out to the field. Remember, Cain is a farmer. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him there. Then the Lord said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? He said. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? So he's smarting off to God on top of, And the Lord said, what have you done? Listen. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you've driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. And the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The very next line has a new title, a new heading in the Bible. It's called The Beginnings of Civilization. And this is the line. Cain knew his wife, found a wife there. We're not going to get into where did she come from and all that. You know, you can talk it over coffee if you'd like. And she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. We've heard of people doing that, right? Just, having a child, creating a city, and then naming the city after their son. Now, let's dissect this whole story, because there's some really cool stuff in it, and there's also some meaning for us in the 21st century. I'm sure you're waiting with bated breath to hear what that could be. So now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. This actually is talking about a time in which there was a shifting in cultures, that there was always a collision of development in time where moving from hunter-gatherers to herders. In other words, instead of going and looking for, the kill, you started to domesticate and to herd and care for groups of animals that you could later slaughter, and you could feed them and make sure that they were kept, and you would have your own supply for your family. And so that makes a lot of sense to us in the 21st century, that of course that would make sense, that's more efficient and effective, and it's more something dependable for the most part. So what you find, though, is a clash not just in how it is that you're managing your food supply, but it starts to make a real shift in your entire worldview and in your culture, and what it enables you to do and how to live. Because if you have your whole herd, yes, you need to keep finding grasslands for them to feed on and fresh water for them to drink. You want to be able to roam around and find that. Cain, on the other hand, represents a whole nother development where instead of going to gather things, you start to raise things. You learn about agriculture, you learn about how things grow, and you begin to save the seeds, planting them, caring for them, cultivating them, and now you have your own supply that you tend to. And you're still in touch with the land, but now you're plotted in place. And you start to become protective of the space in which your crop that you've planted, that you've worked hard, that you've put together, you don't want hunter-gatherers to come through there and strip it because it's all available. You want to set it off and put fences and protect it, and you're planted in place. You can't take this land with you somewhere else. You start to establish a different kind of system and a whole different kind of culture and lifestyle. Not only that, but you also start to depend on a different kind of God. The gods that really were part of those who farmed, or those who began to till the soil and to be involved in producing their own crops and that sort of thing, were often, they saw the seed and the fertility, the death and the resurrection, and the death of the plants, and then the resurrection of them, as being a very kind of feminine cycle. And so Mother Earth became, and feminine goddesses became really the theology of the people who were tillers of the soil. And so the God of Israel, that was more of a powerful one God, or the God that wanted no other false gods before it, had conflict, or felt, the people who followed that God felt that was in conflict with the God of their understanding, who were wanderers and who were herdsmen, who wandered all over. And so that naturally became a natural conflict that you'll see throughout the Hebrew Bible, where they've gone into cities and in part of their taking over what they felt was promised to them by God, they took over a lot of those places that were already settled for hundreds of thousands of years even. So do you kind of see how we have a setup here of a much larger picture than just two people, which is why this really becomes a valuable allegory for us. I'll tell you why in a little bit. So the change in culture becomes a change in religion as well. So another piece of the story is, and the people had regard for Abel and his offering. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. There's a Jewish thought around what that really means, is that in this story, there's no mention of burnt offerings. We always kind of assume, and the pictures in my catechism always showed that Abel, that they were both at altars and that they were burning them, and Abel's was going straight up to God, and the smoke was going straight up, but Cain's was, and then it was kind of, being shunted over to the side, and so then Cain is glowering over there because his isn't going to God, whatever reason. But it's not really said that way. So in the Jewish rabbi tradition of trying to elucidate deeper understanding in the story, because there's no mention of burnt offerings, how did Cain know that God had no regard for his offering? It's suggested in Jewish thought that Abel took his offering to the mountaintop for God. Abel was herdsman, so he had livestock. So he took the best of his livestock, the fat portion, it said. So of his firstlings, he took the fattest ones, supposedly, took them up to the mountaintop and left them there for God to have as an offering. And Cain left his offering of produce for God up there. What happens a day or two later or a week later when they go back and look for him? Well, the livestock wandered away, probably, or were eaten by other animals. Maybe there's even some evidence that there was some kind of feasting that went on up there, and thought that God had accepted his gifts. The produce would still be there, most likely. And so that's one way the Jewish mind, story came down, that there was a reason for that. Because this isn't about God. This is always about us. It's about our interpretations. It's about how we feel about ourselves. It's about our relationship with God. It's about our understanding of how God works. And in Jewish thought and the rabbis that teach, they recognize that you're dealing with a much greater mind than the ego mind of humanity. And so God is always bigger and more surprising than what is involved in an ego thought about what God ought to do and what God ought to reward and what ought to be done and what kind of justice is justice and what isn't. That's starting to sound familiar too? Another interpretation was that God was more delighted with Abel's offering when he was honored with what grew naturally of its own accord, which is the livestock. Really, all Abel was doing was making sure that he took his herd wherever they could eat and wherever they could drink and wherever they'd be safe. That was kind of his job. But he wasn't managing, more than likely, any of their procreation or anything like that. He was just reaping the harvest of well-fed, well-tended stock. Whereas God had a different feeling about the invention of a covetous man and gotten by forcing the ground to produce. In other words, where it wasn't seeded naturally, where things didn't grow necessarily, where there was this. And we don't think of agriculture as being a violence of any kind. We don't think of agriculture as being anything but being in harmony with the cycles and light and all of that. But at this particular shifting and changing time, everything has a different look to it in some ways. If you think about parceling out a part of Mother Nature and saying, this is mine. You can't come here. You have no right to this. This is what I'm doing. I sweated. I worked. I have, plotted out this for me and mine, and you don't get to have any unless I say so. That was a different kind of living, a very different kind of way of being. Another part of the story. God asked, why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desires for you, but you must master it. Here's where Cain is being reminded by God and us, we're being reminded that it doesn't matter how angry we get or how undone or how unjust things are in our lives. We don't get to just wreak retribution. We have a choice. We have the power to understand and to come up with different kinds of solutions than taking violence, using violence to take matters into our own hands. Self-control and self-discipline, and recognizing that we're all in this together, and that just because you do something I don't like does not automatically make you my enemy and unworthy in my sight that I get to kill you. Then God goes another step further when Cain fears that he will now be killed. Why does he fear that he's going to be killed? Because he just lowered the threshold, didn't he? He just acted out in anger and violence. He's the first murderer. This is the story, the first murder. He's just rewrote history for human beings, that there could be fratricide, there could be homicide. And so he's not above it. So now that he's got this guilt and the shame of this deed, he is now ripe for bringing vengeance upon himself. And so guilt is born once again. We had it in Adam and Eve in the creation story, which is why they covered themselves, because they had violated the law and the command of God. Well, we have it again now in this occasion. And so, of course, what we begin to believe is that we are now vulnerable because we have lowered the threshold. Because we've done something wrong, we deserve punishment. God isn't punishing him exactly the way he thinks he might be punished. Because God says, whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Now, this is very interesting because we're not given any indication in the Bible, any of the versions of the Bible that have come down to us, what that mark is. There's lots of speculation about what it is. And Josephus, who is an historian and in Jewish thought, it says this: he also cast him together with his wife out of that land, and when he was afraid that in wandering about he should fall among wild beasts, and by that means perish, in other words, God sending wild beasts to kill him, God bid him not to entertain such a melancholy suspicion, and to go over all the earth without fear of what mischief might he suffer from wild beasts or from others, and setting a mark upon him that he might be known, he commanded him to depart. He placed upon Cain this mark as a warning to others of the consequence of murder. In some traditions, it's believed that Cain also had to confess his sin everywhere he went, because otherwise, how would they know what the mark is? Whatever the mark was so obvious that when it came up in conversation, hey, dude, what's that? What is that? Then he would have to confess his sin, right? So over and over again, he would have to tell what happened, and that what God had told him about this mark and what it meant. And over again, he had the opportunity to find forgiveness within himself and to find some kind of reconciliation in a way. It's not clear that ever occurred. We don't have a document of that. But it's also that the consequences of murder would be taught then by his telling what happened and how he had been driven away from the kind of work that he loved, which was working with the soil, and how he had poisoned it with his own brother's blood. And now, even if he defied God, and probably he would have a story where he actually tried to plant something again, that for whatever the reason, it wouldn't grow there. It wouldn't grow by his hand anymore. That would be a way that the consequence of murder would start to be realized as something that has great consequence and something that should give us pause, even if our own morality wasn't up to that level at that point. It would still make us realize that that would be something we couldn't live with. It's also true that apologists for slavery in the United States equated the mark of Cain with dark skin. That was a twisting of the story and a delivery of the story and some really, attempts at some kind of research that really wasn't validated anywhere, that this had something to do with that was the mark of Cain, and that it indicated that people with dark skin were less favored by God, less worthy, and therefore, I guess, enabled an entire continent to be enslaved. That doesn't sound like very straightforward logic to me. Cain becomes the shadow of every civilization and justification for warring with other tribes and nations and enslaving an entire continent. In other words, in the story, in this allegory, actually what Cain and Abel represent are warring tribes and forms of people at the time of the Hebrews that indicated why they were right to have the enemies that they had, who were descended from east of Eden, where Enoch and all of those descendants, and Edom and all of those others over there who worship a different kind of God, and they were their natural enemies because they did not follow the same God that we do, and they're not herders in the same way that we are. Do you see what I'm saying here? Cain becomes the shadow side of humanity, and it becomes an excuse for us to paint anybody with the mark of Cain in our consciousness that we wish to make inferior, or that we wish to fear, or that we wish to vanquish, or make ourselves better than in some kind of way. This is where that habit became codified, became part of it. Not to say it was invented with this allegory, it was simply codified as a story that helps us to recognize where that comes from and how invalid it is and how arbitrary it is and how untrue it is. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. Now it's starting to sound like Cain is some kind of developer. You know, he built a city. Josephus, the historian, says he also introduced a change in the way, in that way of simplicity wherein men lived before. And he was the author of measures and weights. You know what measures and weights are used for? Trade, right? Wealth building. How it is that you put value on this item over that item and how much I'll give you for it. And if you give me 9 of those, I'll knock off, 10% and share that with you, right? Deal making and all of that kind of thing starts to happen where it didn't happen before in simple barter systems. And whereas they lived innocently and generously, while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about lands. Why? Because you got to have a place to put your stuff, right? You've got to not only have a place to put your stuff, a place to grow your stuff, and then a place to feed your stuff and keep your stuff all together. And we start to own it, and we start to parcel it out, and we start to have to now defend it and protect it and keep the wild animals out because they don't know we've got boundaries now. We've got fences that we keep them out of a part of Mother Nature that they used to roam freely, just like we did. But now we've got places that belong to us and that we own that has never been owned before. And so he set all the boundaries about the lands. He built a city and fortified it with walls, because if you got stuff that other people want, you got to protect yourself, right? Now fear and fearful living is a part of everyday life. And he compelled his family to come together to it and called that city Enoch, after the name of his eldest son. Cities were created in place, farmed its own food, dug wells for water sources, and had temples to the gods and goddesses that really fulfilled their worldview of how the world works and whatever kind of sacrifices and things they needed to do. The cities were considered places of evil and sin to the Hebrews, who were wandering herdsmen for much of their history. There's historical pieces where they were farmers, and they were farmers when they went to the land of milk and honey, because they came to wonderful, amazing, fertile farmland, and that's what they felt God had given them after they killed off the people who were already there. And so do you see how we can, as human beings, it's a complex, complicated way in which we see ourselves as virtuous and don't always accept the consequences of how we live our lives. And what is it that we call good, and what is it that is maybe not so good for other living beings in our wake? Is it starting to sound more like the 21st century to you? It's starting to feel that way to me. The conflict of city dwellers and the roaming, herding nomads is long held in a lot of our history of the world. Our world civilizations really clashed over that, and still do in some parts of the world at least. So for the 21st century, and for wrapping this up, oh God, I'm so sorry. Just realized what time it is. Okay, here's the important stuff. We also live in a time of abrupt and disorienting change. Would you disagree with that? We live in a time of abrupt and disorienting change. There are choices before us. It is up to us to decide, how then shall we live? What is important, and how will we do this? Helen Keller says, when one door of happiness closes, another opens, but we often look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one that has been opened for us. We have to collectively turn our gaze and start to look at new solutions for how we can be together in this changing, disorienting time. Clashing worldviews and ideas of religion and practices threaten our world. We fight wars over them. We threaten each other. We lose our trust in each other because somebody dresses different and prays differently than us and has a different kind of temple or mosque or church than we're familiar with. All of these things are around us right now, and there is so much fear because things are shifting and we don't really see how we can come together or how we can retain the life that we think is good and right and just. It's changing, and we have to be willing to find the good and the right and the just in what evolves and what's next. Dr. Martin Luther King says we are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. When we start living like that, like we know that, like we care about that, that's when new answers will start to come, where we can sort of turn loose of some of the me and mine thinking and start to think of we and our best interests together. What's going to what's the better answer for all of us together? Scapegoating our shadow unto others keeps us in fear, revenge, and retribution. There is no peace in that. There is no harmony as long as we think there's somebody out there that's not good and is wrong, bad, and stupid, and we need to keep them away from us and ours. We have to realize that there is something that is going to be generative for all of us coming together. And today, we too have to answer the question, finally, am I my brother's keeper? Think carefully. How you answer this question is going to change the direction of our world. Terry Tempest Williams says, the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they're praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped, that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. God bless you all.
Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.